for joining us. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Dr. Anisha Parekh and I, Associate Deans for Faculty Development. And as you know, there's a series now every monthly on Mondays from 5:15 to 6:15 on various topics of interest to faculty at all levels in the School of Medicine. Tonight, we'll be hearing from Julie Youm, a Assistant Dean of Education and Compliance, and Megan Osborn, an ER physician and also Vice Chair in Emergency Medicine, Associate Dean for Students, on achieving success as an educator, scholarship and education activity. And I hear rumor that there'll even be breakout rooms, so we're going to actually have homework assigned to us tonight. So Julie, why don't you start us off?
I'm actually going to hand it off to Dr. Osborn.
I'll start us out. Thanks. I like that look of surprise on Julie's face. That was good. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am Megan Osborn. I'm Dean of Students, and I feel that a lot of my advancing through the professorial ranks has been through educational scholarship. I don't have really any clinical research. It's all education-based research. And I have been successful in getting through the professorial ranks that way, even got a double promotion last time in the clinics track. So it is possible to do it with educational research. And so let's talk about some ways to turn your work that you're already doing as educators into scholarships. So the learning objectives for today are to describe Glassix criteria and introduce education research concepts, to list training and faculty development programs to continue to learn about education research, identify opportunities to collaborate with education researchers, and share approaches for becoming contributors to education research. Next slide. So when talking about education research, I just want to define a few terms, and one of those terms is scholarship. And so I think just when you're in education, you want to talk the talk, you want to sound like you know what you're talking about. And so one of the words that we're going to use a lot is scholarship or scholarly activity, scholarly work. I'm just a big proponent of knowing education language. And so one thing that I might also just throw out there, this has nothing to do with today, but is evaluation and assessment and the difference between those. And just you'll sound like a pro if you don't mix these up. And if you correct people behind their backs on misusing the terms. I'm just kidding. But so evaluation and assessment. So evaluation is you evaluate a program, whereas assessment is you assess learners. So a test, for example, or a learner, if you're giving them a quote unquote evaluation of how they did at the end of a clerkship, that would be called an assessment. Whereas an evaluation is of a program. So if you're evaluating whether or not your program was effective, whether or not your residency program is doing well, whether or not this big educational project that you created that we'll talk about today was successful, you're going to do an evaluation. So that's just one of my pet peeves when I hear people mixing those up. So evaluation, assessment. So you as educators now know the difference. Assessment is for learners, evaluation is for programs. You'll be the expert. It'll be one of your pet peeves now when you hear people mix up the terms. But some other terms that we're going to talk about today are scholarship and scholarly activity or scholarly work. Scholarship is just your measure of achievement. So basically, it's easy if you're doing cancer research, for example. You're going to have a number of publications in, so eval, okay, hold on here. Dr. McCrae, survey, eval versus survey versus assessment. Oh, that's a good question. I mean, if you want to comment, Dr. McCrae, I would say that a survey could, I would say a survey is more of a blanket term of feelings and emotions about something or about opinions, whereas you could use a survey tool to do an assessment or an evaluation, but yeah.
Yeah, I feel like a survey, oh yeah.
Oh, she said, didn't want to put you on the spot, personal message. I'm telling you all that I'm broadcasting what Dina McCrae is telling me in the personal message. Sorry to call you out, Dina. Oh, hold on, my lights just turned off in the office, just a second. Okay, all right, so scholarship. So if you're doing cancer research, it's kind of easy to measure, to measure how many papers you've published and things like that. They're going to appear in certain journals, New England Journal and JAMA and things like that. But scholarship, we could measure scholarship of our education work as well in other ways. And that might be through publications, but it might also be through things like social media or through websites and things like that. Scholarly activity or scholarly work just means that you are contributing to the body, you are using scholarship to contribute to the body of work in a scholarly way. So let's talk about how we can become scholarly in our work, in our teaching, in our education. Next slide. So Glassick is this person who wrote this book called Scholarship Assessed. Kind of used the word assessed wrong too. I mean, yeah, I guess it's right. Okay, we'll give Glassick, you know, he's a good educator. We'll give it to him. I think he's using it correctly here. I don't know, maybe evaluation. So Scholarship Assessed, evaluation of the professoriate. And Charles Glassick was the one that wrote about this. And he has these criteria for an expanded definition of scholarship. So typically we thought of scholarship as a research work. But Boyer and Glassick, they're two of the education people that kind of said, hey, no, you know, educators are doing this really good work too, that should be counted as scholarship. And so this is how you would count something as scholarship. So there's 6 criteria for whether or not something meets the criteria of scholarship. And those are, so the first one is clear goals. And so whenever you are creating a project, you should have one of these, you should have meet criteria of all these 6 things. And you know, it's clear goals, it's adequate preparation, appropriate methods, significant results, effective presentation, and reflective critique. And we'll go through each of those. But those are the 6 things. Those are Glassick's criteria to meet education scholarship. And so if you have met all of these 6 things, you can make a case for this is scholarship. I should therefore be promoted based on the fact that I did these works of scholarship as an educator. And when you're going about your educational projects, you should think about these criteria and whether or not you're meeting these criteria and whether or not this project that you're going to spend all this time on, you might as well have it count for scholarship. So like, why do this huge project, this huge curriculum reform, or this, you're creating a new work on pediatric endocrinology for the internal medicine residents. You want to do a lecture series for them, or you created a new gamification something or other for some subject in pediatrics or whatever. So if you're going to go about this big education project, you might as well make it scholarly, and you might as well have the ability to reproduce it so that other educators can use the hard work that you put in on it. And you can use this big project that you're going to do for promotion. So the first one being clear goals. So number one, what's the goal of this project? And in the goal of the project, you might want to think about how if it's a curriculum, for example, you're going to think about how to build it as a curriculum. And if you are building a curriculum, I would encourage you, I'm going to use another term, to use an appropriate framework or conceptual framework. So a conceptual framework is another term in education research that you might want to consider learning about as well. Conceptual framework just basically means that these are the assumptions that I am using to create this education work. And so one of those would be, like, if I am going to create a curriculum, one of the assumptions I'm going to use is that Kern, who is another educator person, Kern gave us a really good framework for how to build a curriculum. And there's like 6 steps. It's always 6 in education for some reason. Did you notice that, Julie? It's 6 goals and 6 steps. So there's 6-step approach to creating curriculum that Kern wrote about. So if I'm going to create a curriculum, the goal of this curriculum is blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to go through I'm going to go in a scholarly way about building this curriculum. I'm going to use Kern. Kern's going to be my theoretical framework for this curriculum. And so just make sure that you're using the appropriate frameworks in education research. Okay, so number one thing is clear goals. So what are the goals for the work? So is there a need, has there been a needs assessment done, and the curriculum needs to be XYZ? And so there's the goal. The goal is to create this curriculum for the residents that covers blank. And then within that, I'm going to have my objectives, right? And so we've all learned about SMART objectives. They need to be measurable and things like that. And so I'm going to write out my objectives for this project, this education project that I've created. And so that could be as simple as, at the end of this session, the learners are going to know the 5 steps to reading an EKG, or it could be a more broad goal. So the first being an objective that I stated, but then a more broad goal, like residents are going to have a better understanding of electrophysiology, cardiology, or whatever. All right. So, 6 core competencies. You're right, Dina. Man, so many 6s here. All right, so clear goals. So clear goals is number 1. And when you're writing up this education scholarship, it's going to be expected that you provide the goals and objectives for this curriculum or this lecture or this series. And that's going to be expected when someone who is peer reviewing your work, they're going to say, oh, well, where are the goals and objectives? This was a work of education scholarship. And so if you're writing to this journal, they're going to expect that you know what Glass-Steagall criteria are and that your work is going to be based on this framework. And so it's just kind of an unspoken rule that if you're trying to create scholarship, that you're going to include these things. Okay, so clear goals. Okay, next is adequate preparation. And so adequate preparation just means that you've done your literature search and you've done maybe a needs assessment to see if this needs to happen. So adequate preparation is the literature search and the conceptual framework for your work. So if you were writing a paper on aspirin versus Plavix, you would do a bunch of literature search on aspirin versus Plavix, right? Like you'd have this whole introduction and be like, you know, aspirin showed a blank decrease in mortality, Plavix showed blank decrease in mortality, blah, 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 blah. And so you're setting up the basis for your paper. In education research, you're going to do the same thing. So number 1, you're going to do research on what's already been out there. Has there been a curriculum already developed on this? And what are the shortfalls of this curriculum? Number 2, you're going to have some background information on what needs to be taught, perhaps from like a national board exam or something like that. These are the concepts that I need to cover in blankety blank. And so that's part of my preparation. I might talk to learners. I might do a needs assessment. What do my learners think needs to happen, blah, blah, blah. And then what have other scholars done in this area, obviously. And then what are the frameworks that I'm going to use to build this work? So if I want to do a simulation training on pediatric cardiology, I am going to then have a framework that might say, well, doing a simulation is better than just giving a lecture because simulation is hands-on. And I believe that hands-on is better because it shows how rather than just knows how. And that's Miller's pyramid and stuff like that. So you want to have your frameworks in there too. So that's adequate preparation. So just as we would prepare to write a paper on aspirin versus Plavix by doing literature search, we're going to do the same thing when we're creating. And that's going to help you also for having an up-to-date teaching concept as well. The next item is appropriate methods. And so here is what are the methods that you're going to use to have this educational experience or this education scholarship or this lecture or this simulation session or this curriculum. And so, and are those the appropriate methods to teach this, for example, or those the appropriate methods to look at this concept? And so just having appropriate methods, and why did you choose these methods? Why did you choose this specific way to analyze this curriculum or to provide this curriculum? And then when you're writing it up, obviously, like what was the methodology that you went through in creating this? We'll use curriculum for lack of a better term. The next is significant results. And significant results, I think, is a little bit harder to show in education research. So let's think about it. In order to really show like amazing significant results, like what needs to happen? So like the end goal for an educator is to improve patient outcomes, right? Like, well, as a medical educator, so maybe not the end goal of like every educator, but a medical educator, like our end goal is to ultimately like make good physicians, right? So if I'm trying to do a pediatric EKG series, like my ultimate goal is that my residents know how to read pediatric EKGs and therefore provide outstanding care to patients and can recognize pediatric EKG emergencies, can recognize when patients can go home, provide cost-effective care for the world, the cost of healthcare goes down as the result of my pediatric EKG lecture. The quality of care goes up as a result of my pediatric EKG lecture. Lives are saved and everyone's happy. So that's going to be really hard to prove, right? Like, so I gave this 30-minute lecture, and like, how am I going to measure like whether or not my residents 10 years from now are like better doctors as a result of my pediatric EKG? And so when you think about that, like, you kind of just like, it's like a wah wah moment as an educator, and you're like, I'm really not doing anything. But then you like look at the medical literature and you're like, they're not doing anything either. Like, nothing is ever like statistically significant. So who cares whether or not I'm like creating better patient outcomes? But at the same time, you do need to show some significance. And so that could be through whether or not your learners learned concepts on a test, or whether or not your learners liked the curricula, or maybe it could be as high as like whether or not your learners had better patient outcomes. There was one paper by Diane Wayne out of Chicago. I don't remember what institution she's with, but she showed this ACLS training simulation session actually improved patient outcomes through their ICU, and it may not have been patient outcomes, but it was like the residents did like way better ACLS as a result of it. And they had checklists, and they measured whether or not all the residents went through steps. So there are some people who will do that specific research, but for us mortals, we're probably just going to show that our residents like the curriculum and it was better, and the surveys were a little bit better. Yeah. So anyway, but mainly, like, did you achieve your goals? Like, did I say like residents will use a 5-step approach to learn to recite EKGs? And so can I show that my residents do that? I can show that through simulation. I can show that through a test. I can show that through another evaluation, or through another assessment tool, excuse me. Next is effective presentation. So effective presentation just means like I wrote this up and provided others with an opportunity to see my results. And so that could be through social media, that could be through various outlets that Julie will speak about. But basically, I've effectively presented this concept. I've done a good literature search. I have references. I've gone about it in a scholarly way, and this is what happened. And then finally, reflective critique. And reflective critique is just basically a synonym for peer review. So there's a lot of peer-reviewed concepts out there, things like MedEd Portal and JET-EM that Julie will speak a little bit more about, that you can publish these type of education projects with. But any work of scholarship should have reflective critique, should have peer review. So those are the 6 criteria: clear goals, adequate preparation, appropriate methods, significant results, effective presentation, and reflective critique. And if you meet all of those 6 things, your work is scholarship. And so I want you to think about that. Number one, about maybe some of the hard work that you've already put in, like maybe you put hours and hours and hours into something and it didn't count for your advancement at all because you weren't able to show that it was scholarship. So I want you to think about it for past projects. And then I want you to think about it for future projects. So like if you're going out to do something with your residents or your medical students or whatever, do it in a scholarly way so that you can get credit for it, because you're already working hard on creating this work of education. And so you might as well make it a scholarly work, because that's just going to take 20% more time. And then now you got credit for it. Whereas before it's going to take 10 hours to create something and you didn't get any credit for it. But if you spent 2 more hours on it, now you're going to get credit for it. And it's going to be a work of scholarship that you can use for your promotion. And it's the academic currency. Dr. Youm.
Thank you, Dr. Osborn. So Dr. Osborn has gone through Glassix criteria. And if you weren't familiar with them, I mean, I think the steps are probably things that you've known or understood, but thinking about that as criteria that you can use to apply to your own work, I think provides a valuable framework, as she shared. And so I wanted to talk about, okay, now you're doing, you want to do education research, you understand Glassix criteria, what can you do with it, right? So and if we use the terminology, this would be scholarly activity. but I'm referring it to as educational activity because that's what we had in the title of our talk. So if I think about educational activity from a few different perspectives, the first perspective I would share is this idea that you want to continue to learn, right? There's always stuff that you can learn. Right now you've learned about Class 6 criteria. If it was new to you, then that's something you learned, but there's a lot of opportunities for training and faculty development in education research, and specifically for medical education research, right? There's a lot of education research that goes on in higher ed, K-12, but I do think that medical education provides a specific niche. And so if you're not familiar with, and I apologize that these are just it's a wall of words here, but the AAMC is the Association of American Medical Colleges, and they kind of govern what happens, in our community at academic medical centers and in medical education. And there's a particular affinity group, the Group on Educational Affairs, the GEA, that looks specifically at education related issues. There's also under the GEA, a medical education scholarship, research, and evaluation section. So there's a group of people, there's a community of people nationally that are dedicated to doing really high quality medical education research. I actually sit on the steering committee for Measure, which is what it's called. So I sit on the steering committee, and I'm happy to share anything that I get from that experience. And recently I've also been able to sit on the steering committee for the GEA, so get to hear the national level discussions in medical education. But one of my personal goals in being on the steering committee this year is to be able to create resources that folks who want to get interested in education research, maybe have a really strong clinical research background, but not so much in education, can figure out how to come and get started. So, if you just Google AAMC GEA, you'll find their website. AAMC GEA Measure, you'll find some resources there. Admittedly, not as well organized as it could be. And again, that's another one of the goals that I'll be working on this year. There's also within the GEA regional groups. So we're in the Western region, the WGEA, and there's a lot of local resources. There's a lot of collaboration, multi-institutional research efforts that are going on within our region. The WGEA is very active. And because it's local, even within, if you think even within, an hour proximity, there's quite a few medical schools, it's an easy way for you to get involved with others who might have similar interests as you. The AMA, the American Medical Association, also focuses on education. They have an accelerating change in medical education section or initiative, and UCI is fortunate to actually be one of the consortium members for the Accelerating Change in Medical Education initiative. And so I think that also brings us a lot of opportunity then to engage in the AMA and their medical education research efforts. You all are probably, familiar with your specialty specific education research conferences and organizations. So, like for example, STFM, the Society of Teachers and Family Medicine, is sort of that body that's looking at education and family medicine. The AERA, the American Educational Research Association, is, in my former world coming from higher ed, is like the place to go and see top-notch innovative research that's going on in the education space. So there's another research, and there's actually a section there that focuses on the professions and health professions being one of them. So that's another resource that you could go to. There's certainly a lot of online resources. If you Google, you'll find lots of things. I just wanted to point out one, which is KeyLime. That's Key Literature in Medical Education. They have these podcasts, and it's a really bright group of education researchers in medical education, bringing to you, key journal articles, key things about doing research in med ed. And so if you have time, that's another place to go and just listen to podcasts that are going on. And then our Office of Medical Education. So Dr. Osborn and I are in the Office of Medical Education, and we're happy to, run workshops or work with anyone who wants to get involved in research. Locally, as I mentioned, we have many medical schools in the area that we are able to, benefit from sharing and resources from. So I wanted to highlight a few of these. The Innovations in Medical Education Conference, the IME conference at USC, is held annually. And if you need a place to go and either have your students present or you want to present, and maybe you don't have the funds or the budgets to, fly somewhere for an education research conference, this is a nice way to go in and get something presented. We always share this with students because it's local, they can drive there, they can present. I also want to point out that this IME conference has a medical education conference certificate program. So annually they have a series of 6 sessions during the conference. And there's another 6. If you complete these six sessions, and I think you can do it over a 2-year period, then you get a certificate in medical education, which is nice because I think that a lot of us are looking for maybe these types of credentials or a more structured way to get into medical education research, and this is a good opportunity. Local. Another local opportunity is through UC Riverside. So annually they have a conference on teaching and learning. And I was privileged to be a part of their planning committee last year. And our goal was to bring in our sister UCs who are local to be able to participate in the conference. So this past year, it was virtual, which made it a lot easier for people to engage in it. But this is another place where if you maybe don't have specific dedicated funds to go present at a regional or national conference, that you could come and get your work presented so that you can get your scholarship out there. So I know we just started talking about planning this for the upcoming year, and I'll be definitely share. It should be in the October timeframe again, but I'll definitely share broadly to school medicine when the conference has been scheduled and you all can submit to the call for proposals. UCSF, a sister medical school, has a really great Academy of Medical Educators, and we've been fortunate to get a lot of advice from them in our office. And there's a lot of great resources. So UCSF in general has a lot of great resources around teaching and learning and great research infrastructure for education research. So I'd recommend that you go there if you just want to find another place to go and look at resources. And then I mentioned the WGEA, that's the Western Group on Educational Affairs for the AAMC. They've just started a webinar series. The first one was about writing a successful WGEA abstract. So if you've never written an abstract for an education conference, you can find this on YouTube. I was going to put the link, but it's really long. So you can just go to YouTube and search, WGEA abstract or writing a successful one. And this is one of the top ones that'll come by. So it's about an hour long, I believe. So if you want some tips on writing an abstract, if you're not used to writing an education abstract versus an abstract for, say, a conference in your specialty, you might want to take a peek at this. Okay, so then there's continuing to learn. And now that you're committed to learning and getting involved with research in that way, the other thing you can start doing is collaborating with other education researchers, right? So there's folks at all these medical schools that want to do education research. There's a lot of very, successful, prolific researchers out there. And so what you want to do is find a mentor in your scholarship niche, right? And so your niche in education might be different from what you're doing in your specialty area, right? And so as Dr. Osborn mentioned, maybe it's, you want to see how simulation is used in, in a virtual environment, for example, right? And maybe that's your niche. And then so, there's people out there doing related research and finding them and reaching out to them for mentors is great. Opportunity for collaboration. Once you become comfortable, you totally get Glassix criteria now. Now you can mentor students or junior faculty or residents and mentor back. So that's another way to collaborate. Seeking research partners at other institutions. So most grants, medical education conferences really like proposals that have multi-institutional involvement, right? Like if you have an educational intervention and it only worked at your one school and your one school is in a rural environment with a small class size, like it's hard to know that it's going to be generalizable, right? So finding partners at other institutions is a really great way to both collaborate and to get your research moving forward. And then also there's research partners that you could find in other disciplines. So just even within UCI, I've worked with people in the School of Information and Computer Sciences. We have a School of Education, we have a School of Law. We have other health professions schools here. So there's seeking researchers for an interprofessional sort of effort is also another way to collaborate. Okay, and then finally, in just trying to then contribute to the field. So we knew in Glassix criteria, like, effective presentation of your work is really important, right? Like, unless you get it out there, it's almost like it didn't happen. So, in thinking about contributing to the field, I wanted to focus on 3 different Ps. So these are 3 Ps and not 6 Ps, but publish, present, and peer review. So if we look at publishing, I think one of the top questions people have when they get into education research is, where can I publish? What medical education journals are out there? I think, specialties have their own education journals, but they're also just medical education journals that focus on medical education in particular. And the AAMC measure, so that subsection of the GEA that I mentioned earlier, puts out an annotated bibliography of journals for education scholarship. So they've done the work for you. So it's been a while. 2019 was the last time they updated it. Then we had a COVID edition that we put out during COVID, right? Because there were a lot of special editions focusing on COVID-19 response related education research. But if you go to the 2019 annotated bibliography, you will find a very comprehensive list of journals that publish education research. And when you look at an entry, it'll show you, you'll get the name of the journal. It'll tell you who their target audience is, what their focus is, how to a link to find them. And again, the heavy lift is done for you. So at least you have a place to start with. It's not just cold Googling. And so I highly recommend that you go and download this resource. MedEd Portal is a AAMC journal. It's the Journal of Teaching and Learning Resources. And I highlight this and JADIM, the Journal of Education and Teaching in Emergency Medicine, which actually is from UCI, the editor-in-chief is Dr. Shannon Toohey and Dr. Osborn, and our great Department of EM is very involved in this. But I highlight these 2 journals because they take scholarship that is not just a manuscript. So they will take a education module, right? So if you had this lecture series that you wanted to get peer reviewed and published, and MedEd Portal is PubMed indexed, right? And it also is very helpful if it's PubMed indexed, so that it's from a peer reviewed journal that will, count for you as you're looking at promotions. MedEd Portal is a really good way to get things published that you've worked on. So let's say you've done a great podcast and you want to share it and you want it to be peer reviewed and you want it to, show up as something that someone else could reference or cite. MedEd portal is one way that you can do that. So the educational summary report that goes along with your educational or digital resource is formatted like a manuscript, but not as involved. And so, the ability to get a resource like that in there is it's more attainable. It's still tough. MedEd portal is still certainly a highly regarded peer-reviewed resource. So,
and Julie, I just wanted to say, can I just say something about this too? I think so. Just in mentoring people who want to do education research, I hear a lot of people who are like, okay, I'm going to do this intervention and I'm going to see if it was more effective than this intervention. And the chances of you having a statistical result are like so small. Like if you're like, I'm going to compare simulation to lecture and see which one was more effective. Like the chances of that intervention with the number of learners that you are going to be able to test it on is so, it's very unlikely. And so I think when Julie's talking about these places to publish, I would strongly encourage you to set up your projects so that you go about it in a scholarly way and just publish that this happened and it was well received, or it was, it met our institution's requirement for X, Y, and Z, requirement that we have from whatever organization. And so I want you to kind of reframe how you think about education research. It doesn't necessarily have to be, we showed that there was this great effect. It just needs to be gone about in a scholarly way.
Thank you, Dr. Osborn. And I think, especially if you've come from research in a different discipline, I think, like, for example, the randomized control trial is like the gold standard, right? But in education, it's a different environment. It's very hard to set something up to always have a control group, for example, because you can't not teach half the medical students something when you're trying something out, right? So there's the qualitative aspects, the quasi-experimental aspects of doing educational research are just as valuable. And even if you can't get a randomized control trial, like Dr. Osborn said, if you set your research up in a scholarly way, there's still opportunities for you to be able to publish and share it. Some the education journals, I think, there's a different framework for how they're evaluating or assessing your research methods and your analysis and your approach. So keeping all that in mind is really important. The last thing that I wanted to share about publishing is that being part of the UCs, we're very fortunate that there's agreements with the UCs and many of the publishers so that we can get discounts on the article publishing charge. And so again, if you Google, I had a big long link in here and I can put it in the chat later, but if you just Google UC article publishing charge discount, you'll get to the page where you'll see the list of full or hybrid open access journals where you get discounts for publishing. So I highly encourage you to look at that, because sometimes that could be, prohibitive in you even considering a journal for publishing your education research. Also, in publishing, the IRB is a super important part. So in doing, so if you're not familiar with the IRB, the Institutional Review Board is a body that reviews the research that you're going to do, and especially if it involves human subjects, to make sure that you're doing it in an ethical way. And so there's a committee that reviews proposals that come in, make sure that, the research that the questions that you're asking, the methods that you're using are not going to, harm anyone or put anyone at risk. And there has been, I'm finding this very unique to UCI. We have this ability, if you have an exempt proposal, and meaning exempt, meaning you're not doing anything super crazy. You know, you want to ask a survey after you've done an educational intervention. It's in an educational setting. It's for educational purposes. There is an ability to do a self-determination checklist to decide if you need to go actually to the full committee review. So if you go, again, Google UCI exempt self-determination tool, this will come up, and you can download the checklist, and it walks you through. It defines like the different categories of what the IRB is looking at, asks you very specific questions about how you're going to do your research, where you're going to store your data, what risks are involved. And if you answer such that it's determined you don't need to do a full IRB approval, then you can just start doing your research, which is really amazing. You need to have completed the self-determination tool. So let's say a journal comes back later and says, did you get IRB approval? You want to show that you had done this to show that it was exempt, and you've self-determined that's exempt. So, you know, you still need to do that, but it's much less effort, and the waiting time for the committee approval, which sometimes could be months, is gone. And I think that's a really huge benefit for us at UCI. The challenge then becomes at other institutions, or, you know, so like if I am doing a multi-institutional study with another institution that doesn't do this, and they need an IRB to rely on, you know, for the work we're going to do together, you may need to, you know, work through that process. And journals also sometimes might actually ask for an IRB protocol number as you're submitting. And so, you know, that can be challenging. But for many cases in doing educational research, this is a really great benefit, and trust that the Office of Research is putting in the researchers we have here. So Dr. Kim has asked, is the needs assessment usually part of the IRB approval? So there is a section in the, in the self-determination checklist where you need to do, you know, at least a basic lit review, and it needs, your research question needs to be sort of placed in a context that makes the research like valuable. So that is something that needs to happen. But again, if you determine after you're doing all that it is exempt, then that's for your own purposes. So it's good practice, as Dr. Osborn mentioned in the Glassix criteria. You really should do the adequate preparation. You should do your lit review, or you won't come up with the research question and goals for your research, I think, that are clear enough to get you, you know, the significant results that you're looking for. Okay, and then the next P is to present. And so there are regional and national conferences. So all those acronyms that I presented on the earlier page all have conferences associated with them. So the AAMC has a national conference. It has regional conferences, the WGEA. There are, you know, specialty specific conferences. The AERA, the American Educational Research Association, has an annual conference. So and then the local ones that I shared, like the one at USC and the one at UC Riverside, are good opportunities to present. If you have an opportunity now, when you've done your work and it's on a really, you know, interesting or innovative finding that you've done in education, you know, take the opportunity to reach out to Dr. Cummins and see if you can do a faculty development workshop around it, or go and present at your grand rounds. Like education research presented at grand rounds is a great opportunity locally, just to share information. Or if you can present a lecture somewhere, you know, here or on campus somewhere. The other ability to present, so besides going into these peer-reviewed or sort of invited opportunities, is that you can self-produce, right? So you can produce videos. There's technology out there that we can help you work through videos, podcasts. You know, you can put up a website. Apple iBooks, as they used to be called, Apple Books, there's a self-publishing process, right? So if you've come up with some great educational guide and you want a place to just get it out there freely, you know, that's the Apple Bookstore provides you the ability to self-publish that. And it's not too difficult to do. So there's opportunities for you to self-publish or produce. The AAMC has taken the effort to consolidate many of their calls for submissions at these regional and national conferences. They've also, you know, put grant opportunities, and you know, there's not as many medical education grants out there, but the opportunities are now, if it's at the AAMC level somewhere, they've put it onto this single page that you can come to. So you can also Google this AAMC call for submissions, and this page should come up, and you'll see a list of things that you can look to present your work. And then, so finally, the third P, peer review. There's opportunities not only for you to present, but for you to participate as a peer reviewer and sort of contribute back in service to the community. So you could volunteer to be a peer reviewer for conferences. So like the WGEA conference is always looking for people to come and review all their abstract submissions. They have, the WGEA also has mini grants that they offer for medical educators, and they're always looking for people to review the mini grants. Journals are certainly looking for people all the time to come in and, you know, review work. I know, especially during COVID, it was very difficult. You know, there were so many things being published, not enough time for people to review. And so, you know, that, as you all know, you're trying to get your work out, you know, like the review process can really sort of put a brake on whether your work, whether it's, you know, significant or not, gets out there. So volunteering as a peer reviewer is one way to get involved in educational or scholarly activity. And then also reviewing for grants. So, you know, if you're fortunate to be a grant recipient, then volunteering to be a grant reviewer also is a great way to get involved. So that leaves us to our discussion questions. Dr. Osborn, I don't know, are you on?
I'm here. Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry, I needed to get to Anaheim by 6:30.
Yeah,
It's not looking good. So yeah, I think we can just do them as a large group if you want to read them off, Julie?
Yeah. Okay. So
Thank
then
you.
we just wanted to take this time to, you know, just sort of, Ryan O'Connell also mentioned that Amazon has a really nice self-publishing opportunity. So thank you for sharing that. So we just wanted to give this opportunity for people to sort of discuss and ask questions. We had some questions that we've already prepared. If you want to put some questions into the chat, we're happy to, you know, read them out and have people respond to them. But I'll just throw out the first question to get the discussion started. So what is a project that you have spent significant time on for which you have not received any credit for promotion, and you were unable to adequately describe or present the project on your CV? Does anyone want to?
I thought Alpesh was going to
I thought so too.
ask a question, but so I'll give one example. Is I train a lot of interns that are from the Cal State University systems, and there's a lot of extra prep work for them on basic lab skills, but it's not part of a course. It's just mentorship of a group of grant recipients. And I haven't really thought of it until the context of tonight, but if I were to more formalize how we intake those individuals and what their questions are and how we address them, that I might be able to make that an actually a scholarly project.
Yeah, and I think one thing I do personally is like if I'm ever going to send out a survey, I always try to include language that suggests that informed that that gets informed consent. So you're letting them know, you know, the key components of that, right? That it's voluntary, it's confidential, you know, there's no risk involved. And I feel like if you do that, then later on, because you know that's a very key question when you're doing your research, is whether you've got informed consent from the population that you want to study. So to think about that ahead of time. So if you're thinking that anything that you're working on could become scholarly work, you know, to always have that frame of reference. And it might be just starting off with that self-determination checklist each time and answering the questions that are involved there, to get you sort of structuring the way you're thinking about approaching your work.
You have language that you include. So I do use Google Forms to ask survey questions of students all the time. And I've never thought about including this is voluntary and it will be confidential. So do you have a standard script you use for that?
I do, yeah. I don't know if it's the best, but I do. I have one that I cut and paste. You know, there's I think when you're on the IRB site, the UCI IRB site, there's a study information sheet template that includes a lot of that language. And I think with online surveys, you know, there's language that you can put in that says, you know, by completing this survey, you are consenting, right? So you're not explicitly getting a written consent, but there's you know, they're informed, and then and they understand that by submitting this, that it could be used, and you know, you're going to use their data in aggregate. You're not going to identify anybody. So it's always good to think about those.
And Julie, I think that the point that that you're making, that it hasn't been quite explicit, obviously, is that you're not necessarily going to use this, but maybe you'll use it in the future. And so therefore you've collected it in an informed way. If you did eventually want to publish or make it a work of educational scholarship, you would want to get the IRB approval either through the self-exemption tool or via full review. But you would do that once you've decided to make your research.
What if you've been doing projects already for years? Then how would you then now turn it into scholarship?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, what's an example? Can you,
well,
can you give us like an example?
I was just going to add, it is possible to use retrospective data, right? But I think you also need to make sure that the protections were in place in sort of, you know, using the data for the purposes that you want.
If you've collected the data for quality improvement purposes, basically, then you can request a waiver of consent from the IRB.
I think part of that question though was like, how do you then publish it though also, right? So
Yes.
do you want to use an example just so that we can kind of talk that through?
So like my project for like the pre-sub-I boot camp or something like that, where I do substantial amount of work to prepare our fourth year medical students. And I have a curriculum that I try to prep them with, but I've been doing this for 6 years, and I haven't published or written up anything.
Yeah, so I would strongly suggest that, I mean, this is a pretty big undertaking. So I would suggest making any appropriate revisions to it that you need to in order to publish it. And so one thing, you know, so I would just go through Glassix criteria. And so what are the goals and objectives? Like, what do you want the students to get out of this course? And then specifically, it's a curriculum. So I would look to Kern to his 6-step approach to writing a curriculum. And so I would use that as your conceptual framework. And the first part of that conceptual framework is a needs assessment. And so with OBGYN, where you're going to gather your needs assessment is going to be based on some things. Like, so maybe the Clerkship Directors Association has a list of concepts that need to be covered during clerkship. Or maybe, interns starting OBGYN, you have the ACGME core competency milestones that they need to be at, milestone 0. So maybe that's where you get it from. So you're going to do your needs assessment based on what they need to learn, and that's and you'll get that from a place that's somewhat scholarly, meaning that if the society has said this is what OBGYN medical students need to learn. And so that's how you'll perform your needs assessment. And so you might need to revise as necessary, but for the most part, you kind of inherently knew all this stuff. And so you probably, have completed some more of the steps than you think you have, but you just need to make it more literal. And so, go through Kern's 6-step approach to curriculum design, make sure that you've done those things, and then go through Glassix criteria, clear goals, appropriate methods being, how did you choose to teach it? Did you teach it through simulation? Did you teach it through whatever? And just kind of go through that list. And I think you'll find that you've done a lot of it. You'll probably have to put in you'll probably have to put in some work to get it published, but as you would any manuscript that you've already done the research for, you're going to have to put some work into writing. And so similarly, revising this curriculum will be about the same amount of time that you would for writing it up for a regular manuscript.
And I think
Thank you.
Christine, I think I would add to that, if you find that there's something that you've done that maybe doesn't qualify it to be original research, right? Like, maybe the methodology wasn't as clean, or, you changed something in the middle of, during the 7 years, there's still other article types that would certainly be appropriate for you to write this up and get it published, right? So there are case reports. There are sometimes special editions of, I remember there was a journal, I don't think they do this anymore, Perspectives in Medical Education, I think, or one of the journals had a failures issue, right? Because you don't get the chance to write about it. They still have it. Yeah. So you don't always get the chance to write up when something fails, but there's still so much to learn from it, right? The community can learn from what you might want to do differently next time, right? So I think that there are opportunities to submit what you have. And then again, MedEd portal, which we had discussed before. So if you have a curriculum that you want to share and get published, you could publish it that way. Maybe you don't have, the statistically significant result in that way because it wasn't set up to do that. Maybe I think it's still worthwhile looking for opportunities to disseminate it.
But just to warn folks, we've got just a few minutes left, and there's one question in the chat. If you could take a look at that.
Okay, for Dr. Osborn, I'm going to read it out. It says, it seems that if you make goals and objectives to MS or peds resident pediatric surgery rotation elective can be scholarly activity.
So
medical student, I'm sorry.
What's that?
It seems that if you make goals and objectives to medical student or pediatric resident surgery rotation elective, it could be scholarly activity.
I think, absolutely. I think that if you were, so it's a curriculum, right? And so a lot of these curricula aren't published. So is there a universal ICU curriculum out there? I don't think there is. Maybe there is for residents, but I don't think there is for medical students. So you could be the first one to write up this curriculum, and let's call it, the Youm ICU curriculum. And everybody is like, oh, well, does your medical school use the Youm ICU curriculum? And so I think, yes, if you do clear goals, if you have goals and objectives, I think you really do need to go about it in a scholarly way. There needs to be a needs assessment. You need to identify in the literature what concepts need to be covered in a critical care curriculum. You need to talk to students. How is this best taught? Talk to faculty. How is this best taught? Look at what they're going to be tested on in the boards, what they're going to be tested on in the USMLE, create your, adapt your curriculum according to those things, and then go through a 6-step approach to creating a curriculum, looking at Kern's 6-step approach to writing curriculum. What is your division of didactics versus patient care versus simulation experience versus blankety blank? And then now you've written this big curriculum. And then what you can do is, talk to your other UC colleagues. Hey, I wrote up this curriculum for an ICU. I think we should all do this. And I'm going to publish this curricula because I wrote it up in a scholarly way. And eventually I'm going to get another paper out of it because I got results from the 5 UCs, and we showed that our students did better on the critical care portions of the USMLE or something like that. I don't know if that's possible, but that's an example.
One quick wrap-up question here is that the question is about the AP10 form. You kind of indicated, Megan, earlier that you'd gotten promoted based on some of your scholarly work in publishing in this domain. So where on an AP10 form do people put that, and can they publish how their approach worked and get credit for that in the AP10 form?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually we wrote this paper recently, actually, on social media in promotions and honors committee, so social media and digital scholarship, and a lot of the concepts are the same. And most schools had language for non-traditional scholarship, we found. And so that I think that's important to know. So not just here at UC, but a lot of my stuff I try to publish into JEDIUM and to MedEd Portal, and or just write it up for these education journals. So most of my stuff it is like via an actual citation, but there is also a spot in the AP10 to I forgot what it's called. I'd have to have my computer in front of me, but it's like projects.
I have it. I have my AP10 up. There's a creative work category.
Yes, creative work.
And I think so. I mean, there's obviously certainly to put in if you're creating digital resources or other types of resources. There's the published categories include creative work, and I certainly on my CV, I have a digital scholarship section so that I can include things that might not fall into the traditional categories yet. So if it doesn't show up in the AP10, it still shows up in your CV somewhere.
All right. Well, it is past 6:15. So I wanted to respect everybody's time. And in particular, I want to thank Dr. Julie Youm and Megan Osborn for their presentation tonight and their advice. I think you'll be getting some follow-up emails from some of the people that were on this Zoom, and get the scholarly work going. That sounds great. Thanks everyone for attending, and just a reminder that next month it's going to be a presentation by Dr. Kyoko Yokomura and myself on merits and promotions for Senate level faculty, and that'll be on the 21st of March. So thanks everyone for attending, and hope to see you a month from now.